Are we ready to go?
Ready to
All
go.
right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Excelsior University, the Center for Social Justice, the Different Abilities Rope Team, and Accessibility Services are thrilled to celebrate International Day of Persons with Disabilities. This afternoon, we're honored to be hosting Jessica Lopez, who I will have the privilege of introducing in a few moments. So welcome, Jessica. Thank you for being with us today. But first, let me introduce Dr. David Scable, President of Excelsior University, who has kindly offered to say a few words about International Day of Persons with Disabilities. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Jessica, and welcome. And thanks to everybody who's joining today. My first introduction to persons of disabilities very directly was when I was a graduate assistant and I was teaching my own class. And I remember coming to class on the first day. You don't know who your students are, they just show up. And one of my students was deaf, and he came with an interpreter who stood next to me at the front of the class and signed to the class. And I thought that was terrific, and I was really pleased to be able to have a student in my class who had special needs, but who was an outstanding student. So I still remember that experience very, very dearly. So as Daniel said, the world celebrates International Day of Persons with Disabilities every December 1st. The celebration was declared by the UN in 1992 as a day meant to promote the rights and well-being of persons with disabilities around the globe while raising awareness about their experiences. Through International Day of Persons with Disabilities, multiple countries and organizations procure the potential of people with disabilities, quote, so that they can participate fully, equally, and effectively in society with others and face no barriers in all aspects of their lives. So in 2022, the World Health Organization launched the Global Report on Health Equity for Persons with Disabilities. This report sets forth the approaches and actions that countries can take to address the health inequities experienced by persons with disabilities. And according to the report, an estimated 1.3 billion people experience significant disability. This represents about 16% of the global population, or 1 in 6 people on the planet. Persons with disabilities have twice the risk of developing health conditions such as depression, asthma, diabetes, stroke, obesity, or poor oral health. Health inequities commonly arise from unfair conditions faced by persons with disabilities, including stigma, discrimination, poverty, exclusion from education and employment, and barriers faced even in the healthcare system itself. Additional studies by the Pew Research Center indicate that about 2/3 of adults with a disability are unable to participate fully in work, school, and other activities, and that persons with disabilities tend to earn less than those who do not have the disability. As a higher education institution, it's important to recognize that persons with disabilities represent a significant portion of the student population, with studies showing that about 1 in 5 enrolled undergraduates report having a disability. Data indicates that these students are significantly less likely to graduate than their peers, and most do not inform their college of their disability. We have much work to do, but I believe that Excelsior University is uniquely positioned to support the post-secondary education and career readiness of students with disabilities. As we celebrate International Day of Persons with Disabilities, let's become better informed and identify ways of serving students with disabilities in the best of our capabilities. Thank you, Daniel. Welcome, Jessica. Daniel, back to you.
Thank you, David. Now I have the privilege of introducing Jessica. But before I do that, let me say a few words of thank you. Thank you, of course, David and the cabinet for your leadership. Thank you, Linda, for all your support and marketing, communications for all their work in getting us to this moment. And of course, Anita in Accessibility Services and Pam in the Center for Social Justice. None of this will be happening without your support, so we really appreciate it. Let me talk a little bit about Jessica, if it's okay. Jessica Lopez is a full-time student and advocate who works to interrupt the narratives we often believe about people with disabilities and to make the world more equitable. Drawing on her lived experience as a woman born without hands and feet, she champions inclusive and accessible education and workforces. Jessica formerly served as AAPD intern at the Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, and currently as a corporate training consultant at the Center for Disability Inclusion. Before this, Jessica served as Disability Inclusion Communication Specialist for Milt Wright and Associates and a social media manager and partnerships coordinator at Diversability. This past academic year, Jessica was president of the Coastline Associated Student Government, as well as treasurer of Region 8 of the Student Senate for California Community Colleges. Her dedication to advocacy has also led her to the California State Capitol, where she engaged with legislators to support accessible education. Most recently, Jessica was recognized as a 2023 Student of the Year at the California Association for Postsecondary Education and Disability, and she was just honored by the Obama Foundation with a 2023 Obama Chesky Voyager Scholarship for Public Service. Welcome, Jessica. We're honored to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. All right, I am going to share my screen. Thank you so much, everybody, for having me and for taking the time out of your day to, spend a little bit of time learning more about, people with disabilities and kind of like how we can build more disability inclusion and allyship. Daniel did a really great, way of kind of introducing me, but I am currently a student triple majoring in business, economics, and communication. I'm currently president of Coastline Associated Student Government, and I'm a legislative advocate who has worked with legislators on building more inclusive policy for students with disabilities and without them. I'm also a disability advocate. I consult with different companies, and I develop trainings on disability inclusion as well. And obviously I was born without hands and feet. You can see that in the photo there. I really, growing up, I was just kind of a mainstream student. I went to a performing arts school, so I did singing, dancing, and drama. And that was something that I really loved. Like, I was able to dance and perform, and I was able to participate in a mainstream school. And I really loved school. I was, a straight A student and somebody who just loved learning. But then all of that kind of like was put on hold because I became chronically ill with a chronic illness that had nothing to do with my physical disability, but just completely stopped my life. And my life became a series of doctor's appointments and trying to figure out how to move past, and move forward. But, everything else kept going and my life just didn't. So during that time, I was just trying to figure out just how do I get to the next step. And one of the ideas that I had was maybe doing like online classes, maybe that would help me. But there was kind of a theory that I didn't really know how that would play out unless I had the access. Until I requested online education from my school district as a part of my accommodation plan. They said that that's not possible. They don't do that. And so every year I would request it. And by the time I became 22 years old, I still had not graduated high school, but I was still trying to get through high school. And that was when the pandemic hit. So everybody was put into online education within a matter of weeks, including my school district. And that just completely changed my life. I was able to complete 2 years of high school in less than 4 months. And I was able to graduate high school and move on to college, where I attend a community college that is also distance learning as well. And I'll be transferring to Arizona State, their online program as well. And I think that was really transformative for me because it taught me that there is a way to provide accommodations to people with disabilities, but institutions have to understand why those accommodations are impactful and they have to be willing to do it. And my school was not willing to do it. I ended up learning later that they had an online education program all along, and they did not tell me. So that was denying me my right to an accommodation. If I had that accommodation, I probably would have graduated at 16, like my original plan was. But you know, life took a different turn. But that experience really made me passionate about building disability inclusion and kind of sharing that story. Because if we can really think how we see accommodation and people with disabilities, we can make things more equitable for everyone. And I'll get into that later. So I want to start off with a little bit of a brain teaser. And if you have an idea, maybe you can put it in the chat. If not, just kind of think about it and play with it in your mind, and I'll come back to it later. So my question is, what do these things have in common? We have the iPhone, the keyboard, and the bicycle. I want you to kind of think about it. If you have an idea, put it in the chat, and we'll come back to it later, and we'll see what the answer is. The first thing that we need to know, though, is there's a lot of people with disabilities. And we don't realize that until we really start looking at the numbers. Like, you know, like we learned, there are over 1 billion people with disabilities, but there's actually 1 in 5 undergraduate students who live with disabilities in the United States. This is a very large proportion. This is not as small of a population as we kind of thought it was. And that means that anything that is impacting students is also impacting disabled students. And so any sort of policy that we're, looking at or we're building, or a structure that we're building, that directly impacts people with disabilities in a larger proportion than we might expect. Within the United States, according to the CDC, 1 in 4 Americans is disabled. That's about 26% of Americans who live with disabilities. And that can range in a lot of different ways. That can be visible, invisible. It can really look very different than we might expect. But like really thinking about this large population, we have to start thinking about how can we bring this conversation to the forefront instead of thinking of it as an afterthought. And how can we support students with disabilities, whether we are, someone who is, a director within an education institution, or whether we're also like a student just trying to support our peers. And that's really, what we're here to kind of think about and explore. So apparently, a lot of institutions just don't really think about how they can bring in people with disabilities. And so we found that through the numbers, there's only 19% of people with disabilities are employed. In comparison, 67% of non-disabled people are employed. So this is a very large gap. And I think the first thing that we often think is that must be because people with disabilities aren't able to work. That's just kind of a logical conclusion. They're unable to do certain things, therefore they can't work. But I'd like to challenge that thought a little bit, because if we start to think outside of the box of what work looks like, what school looks like, we will start seeing those numbers increase. And we actually saw that during the pandemic. As people went into online education, more people with disabilities started enrolling in classes. And the same thing with work. As people went into online work environments, more disabled people were hired. And so the levels of people with disabilities having employment is higher than it's ever been in history. And that is pretty, very reasonably attributed to the fact that, remote learning and remote work has been brought to the forefront, and that has benefited people with disabilities and people without disabilities as well. But the first thing is kind of like, how can we kind of fix these numbers? There's a big disproportionate. We're all kind of aware of these numbers. We're aware of the fact that people with disabilities need a lot more support. And we're aware of the fact that we need to be more inclusive. But what does that actually look like in practice? The first thing is really identifying how do we perceive people with disabilities. Do we perceive them in certain ways? Is the way that we think of them accurate? Is it really, are they experiencing things the way we think they're experiencing things? And how can we bring in their perspective so that they're not just kind of like there trying to tell their stories, but nothing's really getting done. So the first thing is really, when we're thinking about disability, we often have kind of one type of person in mind. We might think of someone with a wheelchair, or we might think of someone with, for example, like cerebral palsy or an intellectual disability. but disability can look very different for different people, and even people with the same disability can, experience their disability in vastly different ways. So there is, disability in physical sense, which is where it's super visible. Like for me, I don't have hands and feet. You can see that. You can see that I use a wheelchair. But then there's also, the fact that people with disabilities can navigate the world, and you can't even tell that they have that at all. And that can include things like chronic illness. It can include things like, a heart disorder, or stomach issues, or chronic health. It can also include, of course, mental health as well. But a lot of these things we don't think about because we can't actually see it. And that's why the numbers are usually surprising to realize that 1 in 4 Americans are disabled, because most people with disabilities, we can't actually see their disability. So, when we start thinking about like what are the dynamics of how we're viewing disability, like I said, visible versus invisible is one part of the equation, but it's also thinking about is it intellectual, is it physical? A lot of people kind of have the assumption that intellectual disability is more common than it is. So people might see someone with a disability and they might assume intellectual disability comes along with it. That's actually not that common compared to how people think, and I'll get into that later. And one of the biggest things that I've noticed with how people view disability is that they often see disability as having to overcome it. It's like you have to overcome your disability in order to function in the world. And I'd like to challenge that perception a little bit. For myself, I live with chronic illness, and now I am doing so many things, but I still have my chronic illness, so I'm not overcoming anything. I'm just adapting to it, and I'm in an environment that's supporting my ability to function. So it's not necessarily that disabled people are overcoming their disabilities, and they shouldn't have to feel like they have to overcome that disability. It's important to think of how people with disabilities are living with their disabilities and even using their disability as an asset, because it brings in more creativity, it brings in more perspectives that we might not have thought of otherwise. And the other perception is kind of, is this person with a disability, are they incapable, or is there an environment that's inaccessible? And that can be as simple as, there's no ramp, there's just stairs, or it can be a lot more deep, and it can go into policies and how institutions are structured. So when we start thinking about these kind of dynamics, we have to start thinking about, okay, there's a billion disabled people out there. What does that look like? We know that there's, different types of disabilities, there's different ways to view it, but we also have to think about what is the culture around these people. 1 billion people is a very large number, so there's a lot of different types of people. You can become disabled at any time in your life. It, spans all genders, races, cultures. And so there's a lot of intersectionality there that comes with being disabled. And that includes disability culture as well. So disability culture is kind of, I like to describe it as bringing in the parts of your disability into the things that you love. So if you are someone who enjoys music, or you someone who enjoys inventing things, or you enjoy research, you can bring in your disability into that conversation, and that disability will shape a lot of how you function and how you live and what you do with your life. Even if it's not necessarily in a super obvious way, your disability is going to impact how you live. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a disability. It would just be nothing. You wouldn't have a disability if it didn't impact you in some way. And so a lot of times people don't really think of disability in this way. They think of it as it's an incidental thing that just kind of happens. But I'd like to kind of challenge that a little bit. Disability culture is something that is everywhere. It includes, disabled people who have become artists, scholars, musicians. They've become inventors and CEOs and leaders, authors, and they've done so much, work within, disability culture, whether it's raising awareness of disability, whether it's, venting or, sharing their experiences, or whether it's just kind of like thinking outside of the box and coming up with new ways to do things. And so I think a lot of the biggest things that I work on is trying to raise awareness to the fact that disability is a culture in and of itself, the same way that being, a minority, or being, identifying as, Black or Hispanic or, Asian. That is also a culture. And so disability is the same way. And so your disability impacts the way you express yourself and the way you live. And really the goal of disability culture is to create new ways of, expressing yourself, but it's not just for disabled people, it's for non-disabled people to enjoy as well. And I think that's one of the things that I've noticed is like disabled people will create incredible things, and people will often think, well, that's for other disabled people. But when disabled people are creating things, it's not just for other disabled people. They're creating for the entire world. So they're bringing in perspectives that you won't think of otherwise. And that includes, stories that have a disabled person as a main character, or, music that talks about, living with, some sort of challenge in your life, or inventing a new company or a new technology. So disability culture is something that comes out of having a disability that benefits the rest of the world. And so it's important to rethink how we see disability so that we can call awareness to the fact that disability culture exists and also celebrate it. And so I'll get into that a little bit later as well. But to kind of foster disability culture, it's like, okay, we know disability culture exists, but how do we like celebrate that and bring that into our organization? How do we make that a part of who we are as people, in the same way that we might bring in other cultures into our environments or our classes or our schools, or our workplace? And I think the first question is really thinking about how are we seeing disability? Are we seeing it as like a bad thing? Are we automatically assuming that a disabled person has a life that is harder than somebody else's? Are we automatically thinking that disabled people are not happy? And if we're thinking about those things, we're really putting a negative viewpoint of disability onto the concept of disability, and that impacts a lot of biases, that impacts how we treat people with disabilities, even if it's not necessarily intended to be negative, even if it's meant to come from an area of compassion. If they're starting with the framework that disability is a bad thing, then everything around how you treat people with disabilities will come from that same viewpoint. So I'd love to kind of challenge that perspective a little bit. Disability can be seen as a source of pride. It can be seen as something that I'm happy to be who I am. I'm happy with my body, and for myself, I can say that 100%. I would not like to have hands and feet. I am glad that I was born without hands and feet, and I don't envy people who do have hands and feet, and because it's made me a part of who I am, and it's made me more creative and happy, even with my disability, and not just in spite of my disability, but because of my disability. Is disability viewed as a neutral or normal part of life, or is it seen as something to avoid and get rid of or cure? And is disability seen as something to celebrate and honor? Is it just seen as a part of that person, or is it kind of seen as something that people have to talk about in order to get accommodations? And I think a lot of times when disability is talked about, that's the context that it's put in, is you're disclosing a disability because you need an accommodation. But it can be talked about in a lot of other ways besides that. It can be talked about as, something that's helped you be a better person, or something that's helped you be stronger. And so if we start to reframe those conversations, we can start to bring in disability culture, and that's the first step. The next step is really thinking about like, how are we talking about disability, and how much are we talking about disability? Are we talking about it in our classes? Are we talking about it like in our research? Are we talking about it in our work environments? What exactly are those conversations that we're thinking about, and how are we bringing that into the fold? Oops, apologies, I switched over a little bit. A lot of times when we really talk about anything, especially in the last couple of years, we're bringing in DEI into the conversation a lot more. We're thinking about, how do institutions impact people who are minorities or first-generation students, for example. But a lot of times we don't think about the disability side of that, which is anything that impacts somebody who is a minority or somebody who is a first generation student is also going to be impacting people with disabilities as well, in perhaps an equal way, but in a very different way. And so how can we bring those ideas into anything that we're working on? So if you're, in a classroom and you're, talking about like the history of something, think about, are there disabled people who invented things? For example, there were disabled suffragettes, and we don't talk about that in our classrooms. The fact that there were disabled women in wheelchairs who were fighting for the right to vote just as equally as women in general. And so bringing those things into the conversation is really important because it starts to remove the tendency to honor disability as, something else. So the next step to bringing in disability culture is anytime you're talking about DEI, always bring in disability as a part of it and think about, how have disabled people impacted our culture as well? How have disabled people might have impacted my own school or, my life? And that's the next step really, to building a way of thinking about disability and building a way of like thinking about disability and just rethinking how we frame disability. The next step is how comfortable are we with the thought of disability? A lot of times disability can be an uncomfortable thought. If you're talking about someone with a serious chronic illness, that chronic illness can be impacting that person negatively, but it can also be impacting them positively as well in other ways. And a lot of times when we think about disability, we are uncomfortable with the topic because maybe we're afraid of being saying the wrong thing. Maybe we're afraid of making mistakes. Maybe we're afraid of not knowing enough about the concept of disability in order to have that conversation. And maybe we're just kind of afraid of, getting into the weeds of things. And so bringing in disability culture means being comfortable with having those hard conversations. Like, what is that perspective that you haven't heard, and how can you bring that into the conversation, even if you are uncomfortable? The best way that you can do that is by learning and doing. You have to do it, and you have to learn and be comfortable with making mistakes, and then be comfortable with learning from the people with disabilities how to do things in a better way. And the last thing is really what comes to mind when you think of disability. If you hear, a disability event is happening somewhere in your college or your workforce, I think a lot of people often think that event is for disabled people. But what if we rethink that? What if a disability event is specifically for non-disabled people, but we just thought it was for disabled people? What if disabled people are creating art for non-disabled people to see their own perspectives? How can we think of disability as a conversation for everyone? Or, how can we think of disability in a context that's not just in a space that is working on DEI? How can we think of disability in the context of a larger cultural conversation within America or a classroom or schools? For myself, I'm the president of my school's student government. My college has done some disability events in the past, but a lot of times they have been focused toward disabled people. But that doesn't bring community between disabled people and non-disabled people. That just brings disabled people to themselves, and it keeps them within that little bubble. And that's not as inclusive as bringing disabled people and non-disabled people together. And so over time in my college, we've tried to work on how can we bring disability to everyone, and how can we bring that perspective to everyone. And what I found is every time that we try to host any sort of disability related event, usually it's only disabled people who show up, because non-disabled people think that it's not a space for them. And I'd like to think about the fact that disabled conversations and culture is a space for everyone. Because you can have a chronic illness and you might not even think of yourself as disabled, but that is a disability as well. So the barrier to accessibility, there's biases, stereotypes, sometimes there's discomfort, and like I kind of alluded to, viewing disability as a bad thing. So how can we remove these barriers? Well, I'm going to go into a little bit of like disability etiquette because I can build that framework of, how to, be inclusive and feel more comfortable with these conversations. The first thing is making sure to use the word disabled. Other words are, they can be okay, but most people with disabilities that I've talked to are most comfortable with the word disability because, for one thing, disability is enshrined in our laws. Any sort of law, the ADA uses the word disability to refer to disability. So the word disability is empowering because if I can say that I have a disability, then I can get the support that I need. And so this is an empowering word rather than a word that has to be associated with stigma or a bad thing. You can use like person with a disability or disabled person, but don't use the word the disabled because that's othering. In the same way that you wouldn't say the black people, you would just say black people. And so it's the same way to be more inclusive and not contribute to that othering. Saying that someone uses or has a wheelchair is more acceptable than using the word wheelchair bound. For myself, my wheelchair is the most empowering object that I own. It allows me to leave my home and travel the world. I've been able to go to Chicago and go to Washington, D.C. only because I have my wheelchair. And so I'm not bound to the wheelchair. It's actually given me a life. And so rethinking how we think about wheelchairs is also really helpful as well. Using the word physical disability rather than things like crippled or lame is also really important. And using the word intellectual disability rather than the word like special or slow, or even the R word, which is actually a slur. And then sometimes we have like different, terms or phrases, sayings that we have within our environment that we just like kind of use without really thinking about what they mean. But it can contribute to the stigma in a way that we might not realize. If we use the word tone deaf, that is used in a negative way. But being deaf isn't necessarily a bad thing, but contributing to that by, using the word tone deaf in a negative way, it's contributing to the bias that deafness is a bad thing. So instead of saying that, you could say they're insensitive or they're missing the point. Same thing with saying that somebody is blind to the facts or they're blind to something. You could just say that they don't understand or maybe they need more clarification. Using the word crippled is also contributing to stigma as well. So instead, you could say, I feel overwhelmed or I just don't know what to do. Same thing with paralyzed. I felt paralyzed when this happened. You could say, I was frozen or I just didn't know what step to take next. Calling someone or something crazy is also contributing to those stigmas. So instead, you could say, oh my gosh, that's wild. The same thing with kind of if we're experiencing an environment where disabled people are, there and it's, obvious that they're disabled, it's really important to really bring in disability inclusion and bring in the fact that you're treating them as you would anybody else. So if you see someone who's disabled, a lot of people have the tendency to not even talk to that person and talk to the person that they're with. But this just treats them as an invisible person. It doesn't bring them or make them feel included. So instead, anytime you see a disabled person, you talk to them. Don't just talk to the person that they're with. And anytime you have a question, you ask that person. Just because that's the best way to get the most accurate information anyways. You want to hear from the person who's having the experience. The other thing is presuming competency. A lot of people assume, for me, I don't have hands and feet. I use a wheelchair, and they will assume that I'm intellectually disabled. I've even been asked, "Are you able to talk?" Yes, I'm able to talk, but why did you think that I wasn't? So don't assume that someone is intellectually disabled. I've actually done the numbers. Only 10% of disabled people are intellectually disabled. So 90% of your encounters with disability will probably not even have anything to do with intellectual disability. And this is not to say that intellectual disability is a bad thing or anything like that, but it can, if you're having that buyer, then it can be hard to, treat that person the way they want to be treated. And just kind of be removing that assumption is also really helpful. Understanding that people in wheelchairs can often walk. They might not be able to walk very long, or maybe their legs give out after a certain amount of time, but it doesn't mean automatically that they're paralyzed. Acknowledging a disability only when it's relevant. So, maybe you see someone with a disability and you feel like, oh, I want to make a joke about their wheelchair. They've probably heard that joke before. Which is okay, but they've heard that joke before. So, acknowledging the disability when it's relevant, but not making it the forefront, because that's not all of who they are. They're also somebody who loves music and they love XYZ. So bringing that into the conversation is also helpful. It's also best to not ask a person what their disability is, because if they feel comfortable sharing their disability with you, then they will. And if they need to share it, then they will. But it doesn't mean that they have to. And the last thing is also like, if somebody is struggling with something and you feel like you want to help them, how can I help them? Just go up to them and feel free to ask them if they need help and like what they need before you help them. For myself, I've had that happen where I was like trying to do something and somebody just kind of stepped in and interrupted what I was doing. But that didn't give me my independence, and they also weren't really aware of what I was trying to do, so they just kind of thought they knew what I was doing. So making sure to be more communicative and asking first before jumping in without permission. So I'm coming back to the beginning of this presentation, and I'm curious to see if anybody came up with any ideas on what these things have in common. The iPhone, the keyboard, and the bicycle. And this is always a really fun question for me because people have different ideas. Some people say it helps you, travel the world, or, some people say that these are all inventions, which they are all inventions. But there's also one other thing that they have in common. And if anybody has any guesses, feel free to put it in the chat. If not, then that's okay. I see in the chat somebody said that they require hands to use. That's a good question, but that's actually not the case. I'm able to use a keyboard without hands, and I'm also able to use the iPhone without hands. So that's a good question, or a good answer. The answer actually is that all of these things were invented by disabled people. The iPhone was invented by a man named Wayne Westerman, who created touchscreens because he had carpal tunnel and his hand was just unusable, and he wasn't able to use anything with buttons. So he invented the touchscreen, and then he sold that technology to Apple, and they put that in the iPhone. The keyboard was invented by a blind woman and her brother. Her brother's name was Agostino Fantoni, and that was created in 1802 to enable her to write letters because she wanted to start writing letters to her family and her friends as well. And bicycle. The precursor to the bicycle was actually the hand cycle, which was invented in 1655 by Stefan Schaeffler. And he was a paraplegic, and he created the hand cycle, which ended up being the very first precursor to bicycles. And the bicycle was later unveiled, I think, like in the 1900s or 1800s. But he created the first like concept of, using wheels and propelling yourself in some capacity. And so these things are a really great way of saying that, hey, someone with a disability can think outside of the box and they can contribute to societies more than we can ever imagine. And all of these inventions have completely changed the way we live, exist, and play in the world. And so when you're bringing in disability inclusion, that is what you're supporting. You're supporting an environment of people who could be the next generation that could invent technologies we've never even dreamed of. And they'll invent those technologies because they're trying to support their own disability. And so all of these inventions were disabled people supporting their own disability. But in turn, they ended up benefiting everybody, and that's considered the curb effect, which is that if you're building accessibility for disabled people, you're also going to benefit other people as well. So being an ally, it means seeking out, disability perspectives, bringing in disability culture, following disabled people on social media, inviting them into your circle. It means learning what ableism is and how it impacts society, and unlearning those biases within ableism. It also means making sure that the policies implemented in your environment are continually evaluated for how they impact disabled people. And not just like a one-time thing, but continually, because I think change and how they impact disabled people will change as well. So every issue is a disability rights issue, and passing it on. Knowledge is power, and calling attention to disability issues is really important to bring in the conversation and raising awareness and challenging those stereotypes. That is pretty much the end of it. I really want to thank you all for inviting me, and I'd also love to open it up for questions as well. You can connect with me on social media. I'm most active on LinkedIn and Instagram. My app is at RealJessL. And then I also have a website and an email there as well. My website is jessical.me, and my email is jessical@gmail.com. One note about that was I was reading from the screen because if there's anybody who's blind in the audience, they'll be able to see what was on the screen as well. So that was my way of being accommodating to anybody who might be blind that I might not even know about. So yeah, I'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Jessica. This was fantastic.
Thank you.
I have had the privilege of listening to Jessica a few times, and I learned so much every single time. So thank you, Jessica. It's really a privilege to have you. There were some things that struck me that I think are really powerful. So I'll just mention them quickly. All policies impact people and students with disabilities, sometimes in a drastic way, and how important it is for us to think of how we design policies, right? And how we adapt policies to be inclusive. Disability is not a monolith. Physical, mental health, neurodiversity. Our ROPE team actually is trying to do that. But that's very important to remember the incredible diversity within, right? Many cannot overcome their disability. They can only adapt to it. And what an important way of thinking about it and of acknowledging, right, the reality. Persons with disabilities are not incapable. They simply lack access. That was very powerful. And thank you for sharing that, Jessica. And I love disability is a culture. The disability culture is available to the entire world. How can we foster a disability culture? Can it be seen as a culture, as a source of pride, a neutral and normal part of life, as something to celebrate and honor, not just as a need for accommodation? And then how much we're talking about disability and how comfortable we are to discuss it. That's work we all need to do, right? And what comes to mind when we think of a disability? Is it only for disabled persons? Is it only about Jedi, or is it for everyone? And I really like to learn about the iPhone keyboard and bicycle, how they were invented by persons with disabilities. So thank you for this and so much more that you shared, Jessica. We have time for us to engage in comments and questions. We recommend that you put your questions in the chat. Sorry, in the question and answer space. But you can also throw something in the chat that will be observant of that. So please go ahead and start asking your questions. And did I hear you, Anita, trying to say something?
Well, I was just going to mention, and as we have gone through COVID, and there's always something new that people are struggling with, and they are disabilities, and we don't even know yet how much and how different COVID has impacted a lot of people and their ability to, their intellectual, repercussions from COVID. The other thing that strikes me as dealing with students from Excelsior University is the majority of the requests are due to mental health. And it's so important that the unseen is as important as the scene piece. So I just wanted to mention, you know, a couple of those things.
Thank you, Anita.
Mm.
We have a question from Douglas Perry. Thank you, Doug, for bringing that up. And I really like this question. Jessica, thank you for your wonderful presentation. I gather that the online experience can really open doors in education and employment for many people with disabilities. Excelsior University is an online institution. What are some ways that Excelsior can reach out to let people with disabilities know about its offerings? And what can Excelsior or any online institution do to improve the online experience for people with disabilities?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's two parts of that. The first thing is if you want to let disabled people know that, you know, you're there for them, it's marketing toward disabled people. Making sure that if you're having any sort of like marketing campaign, come up with some ways of marketing toward disabled people. You know, maybe if you're doing like, you know, some sort of online campaign, you know, one of those online campaigns could be, hey, benefit disabled people. Online education is flexible if you have chronic illness. So that's a great way of um, saying that you're there and you're open for disabled people in a way that's like super obvious by saying you're disabled, then hi, we're here. But then you can also, you know, do it in a lot more subtle ways as well. And the other thing, for, you know, making sure that disabled people know that, you know, you're offering, what your offerings are is partnering with the disability community. There are quite a few disability organizations across the country, Disability In, American Association of People with Disabilities, Diversibility. All of those organizations are led by disabled people, and they have a very wide network of disabled leaders and disabled employees and disabled, you know, disabled people everywhere. And so you can market toward those disabled people, and you can partner with those disability organizations. Um, and that's a great way of, you know, contributing back to the disability community and saying that you value the disability community as, you know, a market. And it's also a good way of, you know, bringing more disabled people into your community as well. And for the other part of that question is how can any online institution do, what can they do to improve the online experience with people with disabilities? That could be a whole nother presentation. But I think the first thing is thinking of online education as another way of learning as you would in the classroom. So if you're a professor who's teaching online, maybe offering, you know, like office hours or offering optional Zoom lectures so that people can come in if they're able to and if they want to, so that they have that face-to-face contact with you, as well as the other part of it, which is, you know, learning on the learning management system or whatever platform that you use. But offering the different modalities so that people can learn however they learn best, which could be reading, or it could be videos, or it could be more face-to-face contact through Zoom, or, you know, whatever platform that you want to use to connect with people in video chat. So that's the first thing, is like really supporting students by giving them multiple modalities of learning. And I think the other thing is just make sure that you bring in disabled people into your leadership. If a disabled person is applying to your job, then they, you know, they might have just as many qualifications as someone who is not disabled. But the thing is that their disability is an asset. So if you're bringing them into your college leadership and you're promoting them and making them managers within your college, then you're gonna see your leadership become a lot more diverse, and they're gonna know how to help disabled people in ways that you might not know how to help. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Jessica. We also have another question. Cynthia asks, first she says vocational rehab is a good place for applying for jobs. And then she asked, do you have any other suggestions for employment? Do you know where to get jobs for us? She asks.
Yeah. So yeah, vocational rehabilitation, the Department of Rehabilitation is a great way of doing that. If you go to the Department of Rehabilitation, you can open up a case and they can help you find jobs. There are other organizations out there who have disability they have job listings that are for disabled people or that are open to hiring disabled people. One of them is called Inclusively, and there's some other ones as well. And the other thing is, if you do, want to hire disabled people, leveraging the job accommodation network is a great way of giving you resources on how to accommodate people, whether you're hiring them or even in your classroom. It doesn't have to be for jobs; it can be for a classroom as well. So yeah, there's several different organizations that offer job listings. The other one that I know of is Lime Connect, Lime Connect. They also do they do job listings as well for disabled people. So those are good resources too.
I am also putting in the chat the link to the different abilities rope team at Excelsior. Each of the rope teams has a section on internship and job databases for the corresponding rope team. So these are databases specifically with opportunities for, in this case, for people with disabilities.
Jessica, one of the things that struck me about what you said is how the global pandemic changed your life. And there are those sweet stories that talk about, right? We know how it affected thousands and even millions of people across the globe. But for some folks, right, it was bittersweet in that it really highlighted the necessity and to change things, to make things more accessible for everyone. And that happened in your case. So I thought that was so profound that, unfortunately, it took a global pandemic for that accessibility to happen for you and for so many others, right? We discovered Wi-Fi issues. We discovered the disparity between people trying to get online. So silver lining somewhere, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In the pandemic, I mean, there's two sides of that coin, which is that it benefited disabled people, but it also harms other disabled people. People who, who are go through life who are blind, who are finding that most of the web is just not accessible to their screen readers, and then everything went online, so everything was inaccessible. So there's two sides of that, which it benefits disabled people and they help disabled people. And COVID is a mass disabling event. It made a lot of people, chronically ill, permanently chronically ill, and so that's another side of it as well. So but there's also the good part of it as well, which is it benefited a lot of people as well, and raised the employment rate and school and all of that. So yeah.
Jessica, I'm a mom and an aunt and a trusted advisor to a lot of young people who are around your age, probably early 20s-ish. And a lot of them are showing up now with chronic illness. And I'm finding, in the mental health world, not just do they have the chronic illness, but now also they have to handle that transition to having a chronic illness. And what would your advice be for me? What's the conversation like to help them get to that adaptation stage where they're embracing it, they're accepting it, and they're moving on and understanding that that's a part of who they are now, and that is what it is in a good light, not in a negative light.
Yeah. I think there's two parts of that, which is the first part is that for myself, like I didn't know if my chronic illness was permanent or not. I didn't know if it would go away. I didn't know if I would maybe find a solution. My hope for the first 10 years of my life was that hopefully it's temporary and I'll find a solution. But I've come to the point where I realized that it's not going to be temporary. It's going to be something I have to live with for the rest of my life, probably. So I think the first part of it is like being okay with the fact that you're grieving the life that you had, and that's something that you have to like learn and process. Like this is the life that I had, and that's something that I missed. All of the plans that I had just probably went out the window, and that's something that you do have to deal with that grief, and it is a legitimate grief, just like losing anything else in your life. But then like moving past the grief is, realizing that people with chronic illness can have amazing lives and they can they can find the support that they need by talking about it and by letting people know that they have chronic illness. And a lot of times, I think a lot of people feel like they have to explain themselves. They have to explain their chronic illness, or they have to tell people what their chronic illness is. You don't have to do that. All you have to do is say you have a chronic illness and this is what you need. So you don't have to go into uh, sharing anything more than you don't want to share. And that's something that I had to figure out how to navigate that. Because it can be really easy to just kind of like overshare and be like, oh, this is my whole chronic illness experience, but you don't have to do that. You can just stick with the basics without having to feel like you have to explain yourself. Some people will have a bias and they'll make you feel like you have to explain yourself, but you don't have to. And then, you know, I think the best thing is seeking out other people with chronic illness who have like gone through those stages, who have made a life for themselves, who are successful, who are socializing and creating a community and building that community for yourself. I did that when I worked at Disabilities. That's a company that created a community for disabled people by disabled people, and that really helped me learn that my perspectives were not mine. I wasn't the only one who saw the world the way I did. There's a lot of other people who do as well. So that's the other thing. You're building that community and learning from other people who have been there.
Thank you so much.
Well, we have time for one more question. So is there any question that anybody would like to ask? So let me ask a question, Jessica. I have seen you in the global stage. We were talking earlier about your experience when receiving the Obama Chesky Award, and you've been at a in the governmental stage, in the higher education stage. What brings you concern and what brings you hope in terms of the opportunities and the challenges that you shared with us? What are efforts that we should join, right? Organizations that are doing a great job that we should follow and find ways of collaborating with them. Any thoughts in that regard?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is the last 3 years have been completely transformative in the disability advocacy space. There has never been more discussion around disability inclusion in history until the last couple of years. And people are, finally starting to be aware of that experience and that part of life. And that, I mean, one of the points that I like to make is, and I think sometimes people feel like this is a threat, but it's not a threat. At some point, if you live long enough, you're probably going to become disabled yourself, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. So preparing for that and also advocating for disabled people means that you'll be benefiting yourself in the long run too. And so one of the things that gives me hope is the fact that we are setting those stages and making things better for the long run. Young people are, starting to bring in disability into the conversation and advocate for that. And then in terms of like, how do you do that practically? There's, a lot of different disability organizations. The Center for Disability Inclusion is one that helps companies build the disability inclusive efforts. American Association of People with Disabilities, they work on the legislative side. The Office of Disability Employment Policy, they work on the employment policy side. The United Nations does things on a global level. Especially they have a lot of different offices. And then there's more, smaller organizations like Easter Seals is one of them. Like Easter, like the holiday, and Seal, like a seal logo. That's one. And then there's other grassroots organizations. There are different universities have student-led disability organizations sometimes. There can be a student government for disability, or there can be like a disability and law organization. So there are different places. You can find disability pretty much anywhere if you look for it. And I think the last thing that I really want people to remember and do is to celebrate Disability Pride Month, which is in July. And it's been celebrated since 1990 when the ADA was passed. But it really celebrates all of these things that I talked about. It celebrates disability culture, and I celebrate the disabled inventors of our history. And so Disability Pride Month in July is a really good way of making that super public, and doing events for that month is really impactful for everybody, not just disabled people, but it'll help non-disabled people learn more as well. And then, of course, International Day of People with Disabilities on December 3rd, which is on Sunday, is also great as well.
Well, Jessica, you are an inspiration, and we're so thrilled that you joined us today. I'm going to read what Mildred Stokes just wrote in the chat, because I share it, and I would be surprised if others in the space don't. Jessica, I do not have a question, but I do want to commend you. Clearly, you are a sterling representation of disabled persons, humble, transparent, and wonderfully blessed to be a dynamic change agent so desperately needed globally and otherwise. So thank you, Jessica. We really appreciate you and appreciate your time. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you, everyone who supported this event. Until the next one.
Thank you, Jessica.